The dawn was a brutal, crystalline thing in Montana, a sharpening of the air that made every breath a small, painful cloud. The women stood in the assembly yard, a huddled constellation of gray dresses and worn-out sweaters, their bodies braced against the cold that seeped up from the frozen ground. They had been roused in the dark, as always, their internal clocks set to the grim rhythm of the camp. The barracks behind them still held the night's scent, a thick mixture of damp wool, the ghost of disinfectant, and the stale sweat of fitful sleep. They waited for the whistle, the signal for roll call, for another day of splitting wood until their shoulders ached, or scrubbing floors until their hands were raw and chapped. The American guard's voice cut through the silence, unfamiliar in its tone. "No work today. It's Christmas." His words landed, then hung in the air, not quite making sense. The women didn't move. Their stillness was a language of its own, learned through months of disappointment. He tried again, slower, enunciating each word as if volume alone could bridge the gap of language and trust. A young woman, who had once taught grammar to schoolchildren in Leipzig, translated the English into soft German. A ripple went through the group, but still no one broke formation. Christmas? The word was an empty shell, a concept that had no purchase here. It meant nothing against the constant gnawing cold, the deep cracks in their skin, the 8-month silence from home that was a heavier burden than any stack of firewood. The guard took a step back, a flicker of frustration crossing his face before it was replaced by something else. Pity, perhaps, or confusion. He gestured vaguely toward the mess hall, a long, low building where yellow light bled from the windows, creating soft, hazy squares on the trampled snow. He said something more, but a gust of wind snatched the words away, tearing them into nothing. Then he turned and left, the crunch of his boots on the gravel path the only sound, fading slowly. The women looked at one another, their expressions guarded, their eyes holding the blank caution of people for whom hope had become a dangerous indulgence. From inside the barracks, a cough echoed, dry and hacking. A tin cup rattled against an iron bed frame. Above them, the sky was a vast, unbroken sheet of old iron, and the air carried the metallic promise of snow that had not yet dared to fall. A scent on the wind, and a cautious advance. An older woman, her posture still rigid with the authority of a former factory supervisor from Dusseldorf, finally broke the silence. "We should wait," she said, her voice low. "See what this is." Her words were not a suggestion, but a command born of survival. To move without orders was to invite trouble. To expect kindness was to invite despair. But then a younger woman, her face pale and thin, tilted her head. "I smell something," she whispered. Her nostrils flared slightly. "It's not the oatmeal, not the coffee. It's something else." It was a sweeter scent, a rich, complicated aroma that cut through the usual bleakness and made her stomach clench with a primal, forgotten longing. The older woman shook her head, a gesture of ingrained skepticism, but her own feet were already shifting, turning her body toward the mess hall. It was an unconscious movement, a betrayal of the very caution she preached. They began to walk, not as a disciplined line, but as a loose, hesitant group. 15 women in patched, identical dresses, their shoulders hunched against the cold, moved across the frozen yard like a slow tide. Their ill-fitting cardigans, donated by some distant charity, did little to keep out the chill. The mess hall sat at the heart of the camp, a utilitarian structure of warped wood and a corrugated tin roof. Its windows were usually clear, but today they were fogged, beaded with condensation from a heat and humidity inside that seemed almost impossible. As they drew closer, the smell grew from a hint into a presence. It was the profound, savory scent of roasting meat, the earthy richness of butter, the warm, comforting spice of cinnamon. One woman, her resolve crumbling, stopped dead in her tracks. She pressed a hand over her mouth, her eyes wide. The others slowed, their steps becoming more tentative, until they formed a silent semicircle before the heavy wooden door. A world transformed inside the mess hall. Through the fogged glass, they could see shadows moving, the Americans setting down plates and bowls. The scene was all wrong. The tables were covered not with the usual stained oilcloth, but with white linen, pressed smooth, a vision of impossible cleanliness. And in the center of each table was a small, defiant gesture of life, a pine branch, freshly cut, tied with a simple piece of red string. The door swung inward before any of them could knock. An American sergeant stood in the doorway, a young man with pale, almost invisible eyebrows and a face that had not yet learned to armor itself. His expression was open, his smile tentative but genuine. He waved them in, a gesture that was both an invitation and a reassurance. They hesitated on the threshold, then filed in slowly, their bodies tense. The warmth hit them first, a physical wave that thawed their frozen cheeks and made them shiver. Then it was the light. Every single overhead bulb was lit, blazing down upon a scene that was utterly alien. The room was brighter than they had ever seen it, the harsh light softened by strings of paper garlands in red and green that someone had strung along the far wall. The tables were set with real plates, heavy white ceramic that promised solidity, a world away from the clattering, dented tin trays they were used to. At each place setting, a folded napkin stood like a white square of origami, and beside it, a fork and knife gleamed, their surfaces polished to a high shine. The women moved through this new world in a daze. Their worn shoes squeaked on the freshly cleaned floor, a sound that seemed obscenely loud in the hush. The American soldiers watched them, but there was no impatience in their gaze, no shouted orders to hurry up. This absence of urgency was perhaps the strangest thing of all, a void where pressure should have been, a bounty beyond naming. At the serving line, the sight that met their eyes was a tableau of abundance that their minds struggled to process. The counter was laden with food that, for a moment, they couldn't even name. There was a whole turkey, its skin a deep golden brown, split in places where savory juices had escaped and caramelized. Next to it was a steel basin heaped with mashed potatoes, a cloud of steam rising from their peaks, a pool of melted butter, sun-yellow, shimmering in the center. There were glazed carrots that shone like jewels, green beans scattered with delicate slivers of almond, and a deep red, jellied cranberry sauce that still held the perfect cylindrical shape of the can, a small, surreal monument to American industry. Dinner rolls were stacked high in a basket, each one glossy with egg wash, their tops perfectly browned. And on a separate table, like a sacred offering, sat 3 pies. Their crusts were intricately crimped, baked to a perfect flaky brown. One of them, a cherry pie, had a star-shaped vent in its center from which a dark, purple juice had bubbled and leaked, a promise of the sweetness within. The women stood before this feast, immobilized. One of them, her hand trembling, reached out and touched the edge of the stainless steel counter, as if to confirm its reality. The metal was warm from the heated pans. An older cook, his apron dusted with flour, gestured gently for them to take plates. He spoke in English, his voice soft, almost apologetic. The young translator whispered, her voice trembling. He says, "To take as much as we want. He says there is plenty. The weight of a full plate." They moved through the line as if in a dream. The Americans served them, their movements careful, deliberate. A soldier spooned a mountain of potatoes onto a plate. The cook himself carved thick slices of turkey, the white and dark meat bending the tines of the forks as he laid them down. The cranberry sauce slid from its can-shaped mold onto a plate with a soft, wet sound, a single, quivering red disc. One woman held out her plate, and when the cook added a second roll, then a third, she tried to gesture that it was enough. He simply shook his head, his smile deepening, and added one more. She looked down at the plate in her hands. It was heaped, a small landscape of food. Gravy, rich and brown, was already seeping into the turkey and pooling around the potatoes. The aromas rose to meet her, the butter, the savory meat, the sharp, metallic tang of the cranberries. Her hands began to shake so violently she had to clutch the plate with both hands to keep from dropping it. She carried it, this impossible burden of kindness, to a table and sat down. The linen napkin felt stiff and foreign in her lap. She did not touch the food. She waited. The others joined her, one by one, each carrying a plate piled high with a bounty they had not seen in years. They sat in a silence that was heavy with unspoken emotion. The Americans continued to move around them, filling glasses with water, bringing out more baskets of rolls, ensuring everyone had been served. A private with a shock of red hair and a face full of freckles paused at their table. He pointed to a picture of milk. Real milk, not the powdered kind. White and cold in a tall glass. Beads of condensation tracing paths down its sides. He poured a cup for a woman who hadn't spoken, set it down gently beside her plate, and moved away before she could even look up. She stared at the milk. The last time she had seen milk like that was in a different life, before the war, before the ration cards that made everything scarce, before the bombers came and the air in her city tasted of burning plaster for weeks. She picked up the glass. It was heavy and cold in her hand. She took a sip. The milk was sweet and clean, coating her tongue, a taste of profound, simple normality. She set the glass down too hard, the click echoing in the quiet room. A single white drop splashed onto the pristine tablecloth. The first bite and the floodgates. Then music began to play. Someone had started a record player, and the sound was scratchy, warm, a big band playing a slow, bright melody. The Americans began to eat at their own tables, talking in low, respectful voices, laughing occasionally, the sound a soft rumble. The mess hall was now a symphony of smells, roasting turkey and wood smoke, butter and coffee, undercut by the faint, medicinal scent of the floor's disinfectant. Outside the windows, the sky was lightening to a pale grey, and the first snowflakes had begun to drift down, small and lazy, catching the light from the windows. Inside, it was warm. The radiators clanked and hissed their steady rhythm. One of the younger women, her hunger finally overcoming her disbelief, picked up her fork. She carefully cut a piece of the turkey. It was so tender it fell apart at the touch of the fork. When she put it in her mouth, she closed her eyes. The salt, the richness, the way the fibers simply melted on her tongue. It was too much. Her throat tightened. She chewed slowly, swallowed, and opened her eyes. The others were watching her, their own forks still poised. She gave a single, slow nod. One by one, they began to eat. The potatoes were smooth and velvety, so hot they could burn the roof of your mouth. The green beans snapped with a fresh crispness, flavored with something savory, likely bacon. The cranberry sauce was a shock of sweetness, almost cloying, but it cut through the richness of the meat perfectly. The rolls yielded a soft, airy interior when torn open, the crust crackling, and the pale yellow butter melted instantly into the warm bread. They ate without speaking. Some savored each bite, making it last, trying to memorize the sensations. Others ate quickly, ravenously, driven by a deep-seated fear that it might all vanish. only to slow down as their shrunken stomachs protested the unaccustomed fullness. The breaking point, a slice of pie. It was the pie that finally shattered the fragile peace they had built around themselves. The cook wheeled out a cart with the 3 pies balanced on top. He began to cut generous slices, serving each woman a portion on a small plate. The apple pie was still warm from the oven. Its flaky crust released a puff of steam when cut, and the filling smelled of cinnamon and cloves, the apples cooked down to a tender, golden sweetness. The woman from Dusseldorf, the pragmatic factory supervisor who had advised caution, picked up her fork. She cut a neat piece from the slice of apple pie, the steam rising to warm her face. She took a bite. The sugar, the spice, the buttery crust. It was a confluence of flavors so potent, so deeply evocative of a lost world of kitchen comforts and family Christmases, that it became a physical blow. She set her fork down. Her hand started to shake uncontrollably. She tried to pick the fork up again, to continue, to be strong, but her fingers refused to obey. She pressed her palms flat against the table, her knuckles white. Then her shoulders began to shake. Across from her, the young teacher from Leipzig put down her own fork. She was crying, not with silent tears, but with a quiet, relentless weeping, her face slick with moisture. She made no attempt to hide it. She picked up the stiff linen napkin and wiped her cheeks, and the feeling of that clean, soft cloth against her skin, a luxury so forgotten it felt like an accusation, only made it worse. She buried her face in her hands, her sobs muffled. The wave of emotion swept through the room. It was a contagion of release. One woman after another laid down her utensil and succumbed to tears. Some cried silently, the tears simply overflowing and tracing paths through the grime and weariness on their faces as they stared at their half-eaten pie. Others wept openly, their bodies racked with sobs, the sound raw and unguarded, a noise of pure, unadulterated grief and relief. The Americans stopped talking. They looked at one another, their faces a mixture of uncertainty and shared sorrow. The young sergeant, who had welcomed them at the door, stood up as if to intervene, to offer comfort, but he was adrift. The older cook placed a firm hand on his shoulder and shook his head. His message was clear. Let them be. This needs to happen. The incongruously cheerful music from the record player suddenly seemed offensive, and someone quickly got up and lifted the needle. The silence that rushed in was thick and heavy. In that quiet, you could hear the hiss of the radiators, the gentle tap of snow against the windows, and the heartbreaking sound of women crying. Women who had not allowed themselves to cry for months, perhaps years, because there had been no point and no safe place for such vulnerability. The anatomy of tears. They cried not for one reason, but for 1,000, all at once. They cried because the food was good, astonishingly so, and they had not expected any goodness to remain in the world. They cried because the Americans had said, "No work today," and "It's Christmas," and they had forgotten that such words could hold meaning. They cried because the turkey was tender, and the milk was cold, and the pie tasted like a memory of home, or like something they had lost so long ago they'd forgotten its name, or like a kindness so profound they had no framework to understand it. They cried because the linen tablecloths were clean, and the napkins were neatly folded, and someone had taken the time to string paper garlands, as if beauty and ceremony still mattered in this place. They cried because the sergeant had smiled with unforced kindness, and the cook had given them extra rolls without being asked, and the red-haired private had poured milk with a quiet, unpitying grace. They cried, most of all, because they were prisoners, far from everything they loved, and they had expected nothing. They had armored themselves for nothing, and they had been given everything, a full stomach, a moment of peace, a gesture of respect. The chasm between the nothing they had prepared for and the everything they had received was so vast and unexpected that the only way to cross it was to break apart. A slow return to the world. The woman from Dusseldorf lifted her head. Her face was blotchy, her eyes red-rimmed and wet. She looked at the half-eaten pie on her plate, the fork lying beside it. With a deliberate slowness, she picked the fork up again. Her hands were steadier now, resolved. She took another bite. It tasted the same, sweet, warm, impossibly good. She chewed and swallowed, and then took another bite. Around her, the other women were following her lead, a silent pact being made. They ate, and cried, and cried, and ate, the two acts becoming one, a necessary purification. The Americans sat in respectful silence. An older corporal, his hair greying at the temples, watched them, and his own eyes glistened with unshed tears. But he did not move or speak. He simply bore witness. Outside, the snow was falling more heavily now, laying a thick, clean blanket over the gravel yard, the barracks roofs, and the skeletal branches of the cottonwood trees beyond the wire fence. Inside the mess hall, the air was a complex mixture of cinnamon and coffee, roasting meat, and the faint, sharp salt of tears. The women finished their pie and wept, and no one told them to stop. Oranges, and the echo of kindness. When the plates were empty, the Americans moved again, clearing them away with gentle efficiency, stacking them quietly. They refilled coffee cups and offered second slices of pie. Some of the women accepted, the primal need for the sweetness overpowering their emotional exhaustion. Others simply sat, their hands wrapped around the warm mugs, absorbing the heat into their bone-chilled fingers. The young teacher rose and walked to the window. She pressed her forehead against the cold pane of glass, watching the snow transform their bleak world into something soft and quiet. Behind her, the Americans cleaned up, scraping plates, wrapping the leftover turkey in waxed paper. The older cook hummed a tuneless melody under his breath. The sergeant was carefully folding the linen tablecloths, smoothing out the creases with a tenderness that was itself a form of speech. The woman at the window tried to conjure a memory, any memory, of the last time she had felt both warm and full. She searched the archives of her mind and found nothing. The sensation was brand new. She turned back to the room. The other women were still at the tables, some now speaking in hushed, fragile voices, others just staring at the empty white spaces of their plates as if they could divine some meaning there. The red-haired private approached their table again, this time carrying a small wooden basket. He set it down in the center. The women looked inside. Oranges. A dozen of them, their skins a blazing, impossible orange against the drabness of the room, like captured suns from a different continent. He gestured for them to take one. The woman from Dusseldorf reached out and picked one up. It was heavy and firm, its skin cool and slightly dimpled. When she pressed her thumbnail gently into the peel, it released a fine, sharp spray of citrus oil, a scent so bright and alien it made her eyes sting anew. She hadn't seen, let alone held, an orange in 3 years. She cradled it in both hands, feeling its weight, its texture, its sheer impossible reality. The private was watching her. He said something in English, and the young translator, her voice thick, whispered the translation. He says, "Merry Christmas." The woman nodded. There were no words in any language that could serve as an adequate response. She held the orange and nodded, and he gave her a small, understanding smile before moving to the next table. The aftermath. A letter and a memory. By noon, it was over. The Americans told them they could return to their barracks. There would be no work for the rest of the day. They could rest, or walk in the yard, or sit in the day room where, they were told, a fire had been lit in the stove. The women stood slowly, their movements cautious, as if a sudden gesture might shatter the delicate spell that had been woven around them. They carried their oranges not as fruit, but as talismans, cradling them against their chests as they filed out. A few stopped to murmur thanks to the cook. He simply nodded, waving them off with a flowery hand, his expression one of profound embarrassment, and turned back to scrubbing his already clean counter. Outside, the snow had slowed. The yard was pristine, a blanket of white that hid the mud and gravel, and the air smelled clean of cold and pine smoke from the day-room chimney. They walked back to the barracks in a loose group, but their pace was different now. Slower, more contemplative, less haunted. Inside the barracks they settled onto their narrow bunks and began, almost ritually, to peel their oranges. The sharp citrus scent burst into the room, a vibrant, living smell that challenged the gloom of damp wool and disinfectant. It was the smell of life, of sun-drenched groves, of a world that still existed somewhere beyond the fences. That night, one of the women, the young teacher, wrote a letter home. She had no envelope, no certainty it would ever be sent, but she wrote it anyway, the words flowing onto the precious paper. She wrote of the turkey and the pie, the cold milk and the impossible oranges. She wrote of the sergeant with the kind face, the cook with the extra rolls, the private who poured milk and said, "Merry Christmas." She wrote of how she had cried and could not stop, and how she did not know why, except that the pie was warm and the napkin was clean and no one had shouted at them to hurry. She wrote that it was Christmas, the Americans had given them a day without work, and she had eaten until she was full. It had been, she concluded, the strangest, saddest, and most beautiful day she could remember. She folded the letter carefully and tucked it beneath her thin pillow. Outside, the snow had begun to fall again, a silent, endless curtain. Inside the barracks, the radiator clanked its familiar, comforting rhythm, and someone, in a low voice, was humming a soft tune. Maybe a Christmas hymn from childhood, maybe just a folk song from a time before the world broke. The woman from Dusseldorf lay on her bunk, the peeled spiral of her orange rind resting on the windowsill beside her, like a fragile, aromatic sculpture. She stared up at the dark ceiling, and with every fibre of her being, she tried to hold on to the feeling, the fleeting, precious feeling of being warm and full and safe, even if it was only for a single day.